unceded Coast Salish territory, kind of AKA Vancouver, BC. I'm the executive director at Aquatic Life Institute, and for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we have been hosting these two kinds of events. So our Effective Aquatic Animal Advocacy events once per month, and then also recently we have taken over from Marianne and co at ACE and other colleagues at the Effective, excuse me, now I'm mixing them up now, Effective Animal Advocacy folks to do the kind of general events that are focused on all kinds of animals, not just aquatic animals. Rocky will tell you, my colleague Rocky will tell you a little bit more about our upcoming events towards the end of this. But yeah, I believe this is the 5th event of the year. They're very informal, and we've had some really, really great speakers and panelists, and today is definitely no exception to that. And so yeah, as the event goes on, feel free to add questions in the chat. They can be directed to a particular guest or to all of the guests. And yeah, we kind of welcome that kind of discussion in the chat. There will be time at the end where Rocky, my colleague, will go through as many of the audience questions or participant questions as we can. And just a note, I think, for everybody that I do believe this is recorded. So I just wanted to give that kind of disclaimer in case folks might not want to say a particular thing given that. So just a heads up. I'm going to let the panelists really introduce themselves in more detail, but I'll give a really, really brief introduction to our 3 amazing panelists. We're honestly, truly, really grateful that they're all with us today. Really impressive backgrounds. The first is Amanda Hungerford. Amanda has worked as a senior program associate at Open Philanthropy since March 2018. Prior to joining Open Phil, Amanda worked as a staff attorney specializing in farm animal issues for the Humane Society of the United States. And before that, Amanda was a clerk for Judge Stefan Underhill of the District of Connecticut. We also have Jacob Eliosoff. Jacob is an NYC-based computer programmer from Montreal. He has been interested in animal welfare work since the 90s and is on the board of directors of the Humane League. In recent years, he's become increasingly involved in the effective altruism community and has been a co-organizer of the EAA NYC group. I know we have lots of people from that group here today. And then last but absolutely not least, somebody else from that group, we have Rachel Atcheson. So Rachel started as an intern with the Humane League and went on to become Senior Campus Outreach Director. Rachel founded the Humane League's Campus Outreach Program and was responsible for its growth from 18 campuses to 52 campuses. Rachel then moved on to work in the New York City Mayor's office as the Animal Welfare Liaison, and she is currently Deputy Strategist for Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, working on some really impressive, really high impact plant-based nutrition initiatives. So yeah, feel free, panelists, if there's anything I missed that you think is kind of pertinent to this conversation, to add that, but I'll move it to the first question to get started. I'll keep it pretty general. So how would you describe your giving philosophy? And maybe I'll open that first to Amanda.
Thanks, Becky. So nice to be here. So good to see all of you. I would be remiss if I did not note that Peter Brandt, my former boss, is here. So Peter, I hope I do a good job for you today. I saw Becky was kind enough to share this question about what is your giving philosophy ahead of time, and I've been agonizing over it and having a real existential crisis of, oh no, this is my entire job, and what is my giving philosophy? I'm not sure that I could give a succinct summary of it, but I will try my best. Some highlights are I try to be fairly evidence-based in my giving, try to be willing to take risks on big bets. So I think it's very easy to, when you're trying to be evidence-based, to only do things that feel very small, easy to measure, but try to not let that keep me from doing things that feel riskier or uncertain, but could potentially be really high impact. And also try to be open-minded about how to achieve the most good. I think it's very easy as an opinionated person to get set into a certain idea of what is the highest impact way that you can improve animal welfare. So I think open-mindedness and a willingness to reevaluate our preconceptions are all things I try to do. I don't know that that's a giving philosophy, but those are some motivating principles.
No, that's a great answer. You really downplayed how great that answer was going to be. So thanks, Amanda. Maybe I'll move it to Rachel next for the same question. Like, how would you describe your giving philosophy?
Yeah, so as someone who doesn't work directly in the field of evaluating charities, I really put a lot of emphasis on who has done the research already, so that I am not duplicating kind of work. And so I rely heavily on ACE, Animal Charity Evaluators, for my donations.
Great answer, especially because I believe their giving guide for this year came out today. So really, really timely. Is there anywhere else you look to, Rachel, outside of ACE, kind of in your philosophy, or is that kind of the main kind of source for you?
Yeah, so as Amanda referenced, we were sent the questions ahead of time, which means that a little bit of my other answer is going to be woven into some of the ongoing.
Great, awesome. Yeah. Maybe same question to you, Jacob. How would you describe your giving philosophy?
Sure. So I would definitely echo Rachel. I think it's a very common mistake, I would say, as a giver to take too much upon yourself, and we have to be a little bit humble. And there are people who have put a lot of time and research into this, and there are people who are doing it full time. People like, for example, Amanda. I mean, I think along with ACE, people like Amanda and her colleagues at Open Philanthropy are people I definitely delegate a lot of my, informing myself to. So I definitely think it's important to rope in the experts and make sure you're not trying to reinvent things that other people who are better equipped have already tried to do. And a second thing I would mention is, I guess I feel like part of my, if you want to get sort of abstract about it and philosophical, I would say part of how I philosophize my giving is the principle of look where you can't see. Look where you can't see. The idea being that I think our intuition often is to sort of, somebody comes up to you and says like, wow, I've got this great project that needs funding. And you're like, wow, that is a great project. So you give them some funding. A certain amount of this is reasonable, but on the whole, I think it's too easy to overweight the things that are presented in front of us, the things that land on our plate, the things that are right in front of our eyes. And then we can forget about things that are happening in other countries, or that aren't in our network, that are maybe other people out there. Or for example, we can forget about millions or billions of animals that just don't happen to be in front of us, and therefore don't enter into our decision-making process naturally. So I think we should push ourselves, and I think this is like a fundamental effective altruism thing. We should push ourselves to make sure that we're not neglecting things just because they're not right in front of our face.
Yeah, thank you all. This is a really good way to start the conversation. The next question is, I guess, pretty related to that, which is, how has your philosophy about giving changed over the last 5 or 10 years? Are there kind of things that you feel like maybe felt like mistakes, or just ways your philosophy has evolved as you've gathered new information and been networking in these given communities and so on? So maybe I'll give that one to Amanda to start again.
Yeah, I think the biggest change in my philanthropy has been the geographic scope. I used to be much more focused on the United States. I live here. I was an advocate doing work here. It was the organizations I knew were here. It felt like easy to give to groups in the US. But I think that was a mistake. I think I overweighted the United States. So many animals, so many people, most of the people are outside of the United States. And there are many organizations doing extremely excellent work internationally. And in some places, it's just your dollar goes so much further internationally, that's been the biggest shift for me in my philanthropy.
Thank you for that, Amanda. Yeah, Rachel, sorry, I'll let you go on there.
Yeah, I'd echo that. Most of my donations have changed from being domestic to international as well. I would also kind of look at replaceability with donations. If I don't give to this organization, will there be someone else to step in my place? And so as I have turned a lot of my donations toward fish, because I just find that is not something that people are excited to be donating toward, sadly. And so I look at replaceability a lot. Another item that I look at as regarding to kind of donor theory is something that, where do we potentially not get the tax write-off for? So, when you look at political contributions, they're indeed contributions. They are not a donation, but I have shifted a portion of my donations each year to give small amounts to politicians who are animal friendly. I've done that on the local level in New York City and New York State, but it's definitely a change that I did not. I was not giving to any political candidate before a few years ago.
We'll definitely get more into that political question later, Rachel. Thank you for raising that. I think sometimes a little bit neglected in some areas of EA, so we're glad we can talk about that a bit more. What about for you, Jacob? How has your kind of philosophy on giving changed in the last 5 or 10 years or more?
Yeah, it's really nice that you're going to me last every time, Becky, because as you know, I'm trying an experiment here where I did not read the questions in advance. So we'll sort of see how that goes. Feel free to pick on me first, though. Let's push this as far as it'll go.
I'll try to catch you out soon.
But yeah, I would say the number one change evolution for me is pretty easy to pick out, I think, which is over the last few years. Prior to the last few years, I was very prone to going it alone. I think I don't know, it's partly just my temperament. I would like do some web research and stuff. And, I would do some thinking, and I'd have to try to think how much I consulted people. I mean, when I found websites like Animal Charity Evaluators or GiveWell and things like that, I would definitely look at them and try to incorporate them. But I was fundamentally out there doing my own thing and sort of writing a check here and there. And over the last few years, I've gotten a lot more involved with other groups. And in particular, for me, the effective altruism community, the New York effective altruism community and the more global community. And that has been a big change for me. And there's a lot more bouncing ideas off of other people and picking up gossip about what's been working and what hasn't been working, what groups are going up in flames and so on. And just generally having my ideas tested, some talking to somebody and they'll be talking about how they think some group is doing fantastic work. And then I'm thinking, well, that's funny because I'm supporting that other group. And then you talk about it, or not just groups, but interventions. So broadly, I think I now put a lot more value on collaboration and bouncing ideas off other people and trying to do these things as part of a community. And I think with hindsight, I think going solo on all this stuff for so long was a mistake and probably resulted in having quite a bit less impact than I could have.
Yeah, great answers. Thank you all. The next question I wanted to raise to you all was about kind of the question of equity, both gender equity, racial equity, inclusivity, all of these issues that it seems kind of from my perspective of working in nonprofits that we're talking about more and more. I'm glad to see. So I'm interested in how those conversations about equity might have impacted the way you give or the way you advise your colleagues and your organizations to give. So maybe I can start with Amanda or Rachel, give Jacob a chance to think.
Yeah, I'll start that one off. So one, I mean, in the moment of that we, at least domestically in the United States, are with BLM, I think it's a great opportunity for us to be really introspective of our movement. And really highlight organizations like Encompass, for instance, doing phenomenal work. But also highlighting that, when I was at THL, we often were talking to students and trying to inspire them to really make the changes and be the changes they want to see and use their voice on campus. And donors actually have a very large voice as well. And so if donors approach organizations and say, hey, female leadership, leadership from people of color, I mean, these are all very important things that I think maybe we might take for granted, but when you look at the makeup of leadership, it is still more white male than I think we will see in 5 or 10 years. And so, that timeline is a portion of that timeline is on us as donors to speed up. And so if we can bring that to the attention of other donors, of the organizations themselves to say, how are you prioritizing diversity on your board? These are things that I think, these simple questions that, are not very hard for us to ask, I think can help move the needle faster.
Sorry, my computer froze there. Amanda or Jacob, just opening that same question to one of you.
I would echo a lot of what Rachel would say. I would also echo something that Jacob said earlier, asking yourself, how am I coming across giving opportunities? It's so easy, especially if you're enmeshed in a community, to give to the people you know, or the people you've heard of, or the friends of the friends, or the friends of the friends of the friends. Most of my social network are people in the movement, and so it feels very easy to give to those people, or people connected to those people. That's very inequitable, and I think leads to inequitable giving practices. So being more thoughtful about seeking out different groups, casting a wide net, trying to evaluate with a more self-critical and objective eye. I also think it's helpful to look at the patterns in who you're giving to. Who are the program leads, who are the executive directors, are there demographic patterns that you see recurring, and try to be honest and interrogative with yourself about what is causing this, if you're seeing patterns, and how can you break those patterns.
And yeah, I'll chime in here. I think it's a challenging question. On the one hand, I feel like from an effective altruism point of view, for me, part of what effective altruism is supposed to be doing is helping us stay sort of maintain some arm's length from whatever movement happens to be prominent in society at any given moment. So when there's an issue that's in all the newspapers, I think it is partly the role of effective altruism to make sure that we don't get too sucked up into that, and that we keep our eyes on things that are not in the newspapers. So that's the side of me which has some skepticism about this year's push for diversity and inclusion and equity. The flip side is there are elements of this that I'm sure a lot of us can agree on. I don't think if we just have a movement which represents, a bunch of rich white guys, for instance, that's not in the interest of the animals. That's not going to build the kind of mass support or a really mass movement, a global movement, which is, I think, what the issue deserves. So we have to be conscious of that, and we have to make sure that people feel welcome, and that efforts are made to make sure that it doesn't just remain the same little band of insiders speaking their insider jargon. We have to try to be accessible and welcoming. And I guess one thing I would highlight is I think that I'm biased because I'm affiliated with the Humane League, but I think that the Open Wing Alliance, the project of the Humane League, which has to build a truly global network of animal activism groups and get them all sort of collaborating and in touch with each other and learning from each other. I think that's, to me, one of the most inspiring projects I've seen in my life. I think Open Wing Alliance is still early days, but I think there's already, last I checked, there were, I think, 80-something groups from really all over the world. And I think that's a much more promising for the model for the future of where we want this movement to be, rather than, some people in Oxford and the Bay Area just sort of philosophizing about animals. So I see a lot of positives there.
And if I can push back a little, Jacob and I are best friends. So this is all in friendly fire. But I would say, with the notion that EA shouldn't really jump on the bandwagons of like just the next wave. I think that is right to be critical, but I think something like BLM is just overdue. I think that it's like a couple decades overdue, and so I don't see it as being like hot button issue that is going to in any way, diversity and inclusion. I don't see as being a hot button issue that's going to go away, and not that you were insinuating that it would, but I think that that's my immediate pushback on that.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that, Rachel. That's, yeah, a really helpful way to frame it, I think, as well. We can, of course, talk more about these issues of equity that, you know, have kind of been an elephant in the room in animal rights for a long time, and other nonprofit kind of areas too. We can absolutely talk more about that if the interest is there. This is kind of, I suppose, related to the equity piece, maybe in a less overt way, but I'm wondering what you all think about this issue of, I think there can sometimes be, and perhaps this is more an old school approach of maybe donors or even just supporters who aren't donors really pushing organizations to reduce overheads, 90% of my money should be going to programs, like that kind of approach, and being maybe upset when a higher percentage that they would like were going to operations and payroll. So I'm wondering, how can we balance that kind of desire to have our organizations be kind of like effective and lean, while also making sure that our staff are well paid and well looked after and kind of more sustainable, perhaps. So I'm interested if that's something you've come across as a donor or as a kind of someone working in the philanthropy space. And if you see that that's changing now, where maybe people understand more the need for things like paying staff like a more equitable wage. So maybe open that to any of you three who have any thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I completely agree with everything you've said, Becky. I think that has been extremely harmful to the movement. And I think, ironically, this move for like maximist efficiency and effectiveness has actually made the movement very ineffective and inefficient. And we're burning through advocates because they're not paid a living wage. It's a huge problem. I think donors have absolutely contributed to this problem. I do see this as being something that's discussed a lot more in funding circles, how to make sure groups are more sustainable. I think there are a lot of ways that donors can do this. I think where possible, donors should pay multi-year cycles, should not restrict their giving just to programmatic work, but should let organizations, you know, fund development staff and HR staff and all sorts of other folks. And when there's a high degree of trust between a funder and an organization, I think, you know, best practice is to just give a general operating support grant and to trust that the organization knows better, in most cases, than the funder, how the funding should be spent. I suspect I'm preaching to the choir here, but those are my thoughts on that.
All right, I'll take the chance to go next on this one. I don't have any radical disagreements here. I do think it's a subtle issue. Nobody should ever present these things in black and white terms. It's very possible for a nonprofit to waste money. So we can't just say, you know, I'm happy to spend whatever you guys think you should spend. But on the whole, I agree with what both of you said. I mean, I think there's been an excessive focus on on money going to programs. There's a sort of conventional point here, which is made in effective altruism circles, that you have to focus on the right thing. If you have a group which is very efficiently and very honestly and very economically doing something that is just not that important in the scheme of things, I guess, your local lawn care association or something. I mean, they may be very honest and they may spend 90% of their budget on the lawn care, but it's lawn care, right? So I think there is this idea that if you're doing something where the potential impact is high enough, that can outweigh a lot of these excessive costs, or the percent of budget going to programs is a very crude measure, I think, and is a measure which has received a lot of attention, so arguably undue attention. I guess the last thing I would say about that is I think when possible, a focus on measurable results is a way of bypassing all this. And this is sort of how it works in business, I would like to think. Business at its best anyway, where it's like, well, you say, your company is paying its CEO this huge salary, but also your company is crushing its competitors and delivering fantastic products to its users. In the business world, they're sort of broadly okay with that. They're, yeah, maybe we could pay the CEO a little less and get away with that, but they're fundamentally more focused on the numbers they see coming out of the business. So to the extent, we can't always do that. I don't think fundamentally what charities are doing is not as reducible to crude numbers as what most businesses are doing. That's just a reality. But when we can measure results, that's great, and we should totally do it. and that will allow you to, that will relieve the pressure in a lot of these situations, I think, where you have a charity which some, you know, a donor says, well, it seems to me you're spending a lot of money on your staff and they're not working, you know, 80-hour weeks, so why is that? And then the organization should be able to come back and say, well, look, this is the stuff we've accomplished in recent years. You know, this is great stuff. These are the groups that have looked into that stuff and have shown that it is actually, you know, a very significant result given our resources. So I would like to think that measuring results, which is a very EA thing, in the ideal, is also a way of relieving this, you know, obsession with % of budget spent on programs and so on.
And I don't have anything else to add to that. That was well said by both of you.
Thank you. I was going to ask this one later, but maybe I'll segue into it now because Jacob touched on it, I think, really nicely, which is that how do you make decisions when maybe there's limited data or information on a cause, or where it's perhaps like intrinsically just more difficult to measure the impact? So maybe it's like a media organization, maybe it's sanctuary, maybe it's public education. How do you kind of approach that difficulty in your work? No one's jumping to it.
Definitely not jumping to this because there's not a great answer. I don't have a great answer to it. This is where I kind of lean heavily onto replaceability and looking at, if I am not that donor who is going out on a limb for, you know, a newer charity, for instance, will someone else be filling that hole? There are metrics, whether or not they're the metrics that, you know, ACE has put forth, you know, that is a kind of other question. But there are kind of always metrics with animal charities. And so, yeah, there's a need to look at just new, we're not solving the issue. We don't have an answer. And so we need to look at a kind of a diversity of tactics. Yeah.
All right.
Oh yeah, great. Thanks, Jacob.
So yeah, I mean, mostly just echoing that. I think on the one hand, there are important issues where we just don't have as much data available. And I think actually animal work, if you can, I mean, I think about this, maybe it's from a slightly narrow effective altruism perspective, but in the effective altruism world, you have these amazing, you know, Against Malaria Foundation and so on. You have organizations that are doing very tangible, very well, sort of scientifically well-founded work where they can point and say, this is how many lives we're saving with this, with this many dollars and so on. With a lot of animal work, we struggle to have supportive evidence that strong, but of course we think we're working on a very important issue where there's these millions, billions, in some cases even trillions of animals whose lives are at stake or who are suffering terribly. So we're able to sort of balance, we try to balance the lack of really strong scientific supportive evidence for some of what we do by saying, yeah, the science isn't quite as rock solid, but the issue is obviously still important. So I think it's reasonable to say that, I guess the breakdown, the way I break it down is you have the sort of relatively reliable bets where you can see how you're going to help, and you have other more speculative kind of long shots where you might put in a lot of time or money and maybe nothing comes of it. That's an accepted risk because there's this huge potential upside. So we have a sort of, you know, what is it, an efficient frontier or something. We have a spectrum of high risk, high reward to lower risk, but perhaps somewhat lower reward. But the only thing I would add on top of that is, having talked to donors about, in these terms, I find that sometimes donors have a tendency, I think, to say, yeah, well, this is a high risk thing because we don't have any evidence at all that it will work. But there's really high reward. Like the best case is tremendous. And you know, the best case for anything is tremendous. Like I think we have to hold ourselves to a slightly higher discipline than that, at least for most of what we're doing, or at least some of what we're doing. This risk reward analysis can't just become an excuse to justify anything by saying, oh, well, there is this possibility it's this huge home run. So I think donors, I have seen donors to I've seen donors err in that direction, and I think as donors, people should feel that they should feel some obligation to have like strong factual evidence supporting some real evidence supporting the results, the impact of most of what they support. Supporting a few long shots here and there, absolutely, but if you find yourself justifying most of your donations by some combination of there's a chance that it would be really fantastic, and also, by the way, the organization is run by my best friend, I don't think this is how we should be doing most of our donating.
The only things I'd add to that is where there's a lack of research because the theory of change is very long-term. I think it's helpful to be extremely clear with yourself about what the theory of change is and then block in milestones. So we expect that, like, I have this theory that if I do this thing in 100 years, everyone will be vegan. Okay, well, I'm not just going to fund that for 100 years and like fingers crossed. You know, okay, so in 10 years, what should I see? In 5 years, what should I see? And if we're not seeing those milestones, is there a good explanation for how that theory of change is still correct? Or does that mean that that theory of change maybe is wrong and we should reevaluate? And then the easier ones, if something is unknown because it's new, if it's like a new tactic that someone is trying, in that case, I'll feel a lot more comfortable by giving a test grant. So a smaller grant that I would normally give, maybe it'll fail, maybe it'll succeed, and then scale up if we see success. And then the third thing I would say is that I rely a lot on independent research. I think we're very fortunate in this moment in the farm animal space that there's a lot more organizations doing long-term, really rigorous research projects than I think we've really ever seen before. And so if I have a lot of different grants that coalesce against this idea of like, okay, what would I have to see to think that this theory of change was right in China? Maybe I'll ask, you know, rethink priorities. Hey, what do you think about this? Or rely on other organizations like that.
A little bit of a segue, but I know Rachel touched on it earlier when Rachel mentioned being particularly interested in fish causes right now. So I'm interested in kind of specifically the three of you, if there are any particular cause areas you're particularly excited about right now or interested in, whether it's like Rachel mentioned, fish or another species or another particular harm, or whether you are thinking more about kind of methods, so kind of like legislative work versus funding litigation, perhaps, because that's your background, Amanda, versus grassroots work. So pretty open question, and yeah, open that to the three of you. So kind of, I guess, in summary, what are you excited about, both substantively and in terms of methods right now?
I honestly am excited about the diversity of what to give to. I mean, there's so many options right now that in some ways, you know, we're spoiled as donors for having so many good options. Because, you know, you've got things like GFI, you've got things like Aquatic Life, you've got things like THL, vegan friendly. I mean, there's just so many different orgs doing different aspects of the movement, moving aspects of the movement forward. So there's a lot out there, and it means that I'm divvying up my money less than I'm giving, you know, a single group a large chunk of change, but it's a very exciting time for our movement.
I can go next. There are actually a lot of things that I'm excited by right now too, which, if you know me, I'm actually a pretty cynical, negative person. So it's exciting for me that I'm happy about so many things right now. Fish, I'm just amazed by how much traction fish campaigns have gotten. I think fish was a good call for a lot of reasons for groups to start focusing on, but I had very low expectations. And I think if we were seeing no results, it still might be a pretty good idea. But the results that we're seeing are, yeah, exceed my expectations. I am excited about all the work going on in Asia right now. There are a lot of new groups or young groups or previously small groups that are growing, that are collaborating with each other, that are doing across Asia, multiple country campaigns and having success, which I also thought Asia was not a place where we were going to see a huge amount of traction at this stage. So that's wonderful. And I'm excited about the policy work that's happening in Europe right now. It seems like there's a pretty good chance that the European Commission is going to have new regulations that improve the lives of farm animals. I was pretty skeptical about how feasible that was. So many things that I'm positively surprised by at the moment.
And yeah, I certainly fish. I mean, of course, we're on a call hosted by ALI, but I do think the progress on fish is still very early, but the movement in the last couple of years is very exciting after very little before that, from what I can see. And yeah, I think Aquatic Life Institute definitely has played a significant role in that. So kudos to you guys. I think, so the big picture on sort of tactics and on like ways of achieving things is that I feel like a lot of progress has been made. I feel like from my perspective, 10 years ago, say, you know, being a vegan or somebody who cared about animal welfare, I felt like groundwork was being laid, but I feel like a lot more is being achieved on the ground now than was then. So I think the movement on corporate campaigns and sort of, I think a lot of things are moving in the right direction there. It's still a horrible problem, and it's a growing problem. The meat consumption is growing. Animals are, you know, factory farming is continuing to grow as an industry in various parts of the world. We should never feel too complacent here. It's a terrible situation, but it's great to see progress to the extent we have. So in terms of tactics, I feel like things are in good shape. On the more substantive side of like, what are the different sort of broad challenges within animal welfare, and are there new sort of battlefronts we should be entering and stuff? I just find this stuff extremely confusing. I mean, I feel like I'm glad that we're thinking about some of these challenges, but the challenges to me are immense. That what we're going to do about fish, you know, between the behavior of fish in the wild and wild caught fish and farmed fish, I just don't know what endpoint we're going to get at there. You know, you can look at something like, if you really believe, for instance, that you know, that cage-free is a huge improvement for chicken welfare, which is itself debatable. But if you believe that, you can at least say we're making a lot of progress on this front. You know, yeah, progress is going well. When it comes to things like, for example, wild animals, we are just at the early stages of understanding what is, you know, how big the problem is and how much of it is manageable by us, how likely we are to have a positive rather than negative effect on it. You know, these are just sort of like philosophically staggering issues. We will eventually get, I suspect, to insects, you know, and to smaller organisms, and maybe beyond. I'm not even going to speculate about beyond, but even well short of insects, we're at problems where, you know, I worry that we may, as a movement, end up confronting some issues of that magnitude where we just end up throwing up our hands and saying this is beyond us. This is like a philosophical. This is like an existential problem for life or something. So anyway, we'll deal with that if we have to deal with it. I'm glad people are thinking about it, but at least now, on the fronts where we are working and where we do understand the problems we're working on, it's great to see progress being made faster and the movement collaborating well and developing amazing new tactics. And, you know, every time I hear about some $5 or $10 million animal group getting some major concession out of a multi-mega billionaire corporation, I'm just like, this is awesome. I mean, we're doing something right. So there's that. At least there's that.
These are all really, really great answers. Are there any kind of takeaways you want to make sure you get in before we move over to the audience Q&A?
I would like to just kind of make a plug to, as the EAA community, as anyone who is just attending this event, to really push yourself to potentially donate more this year. This year is a really rough year for a lot of people and a lot of non-human animals. And so if at all possible, I know I've been slowly increasing the percentage. You know, I signed the Giving What We Can pledge 5 or so years ago. I've increased that to roughly 20% of my salary. Now, mind you, I don't have student debt, so that is a major reason why I can do that. But nonetheless, I have definitely made concessions of what I do, how I spend my money in order to prioritize donating. And I just hope that people attending this call will kind of just try and push yourself even further than what you thought might be possible, because definitely this year is going to be tough for animal orgs to just continue doing what they have been doing. I don't know how any animal org is able to expand this year just due to the financial world that we live in. But I would push anyone to, give as much as you can.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Yeah, we haven't really, I suppose, touched on the other elephant in the room of COVID and just the influence of just the general economy on the whole sector. So really helpful you brought that up. Any kind of other thoughts from you, Amanda or Jacob, before we move into the audience Q&A, and I hand it over to Rocky for that?
I would also encourage folks, to the extent they're able, to try to give internationally. It can be quite logistically challenging sometimes. One way around that is through ACE giving. With an ACE charity, you can often give through them, and you're giving to a US organization, but the funding goes to an international organization. If you're less worried about tax implications, I just think your dollar can go so far there. And a lot of those organizations are doing extraordinary work, and I think they have less access to donors than most US-based organizations, so have been particularly hard hit recently.
I would just maybe, as a follow-on to what Rachel said, of course, the situation, as we keep saying, is urgent out there, or is, there's a lot of important work that needs to be done, and we should all try to motivate ourselves to help with it. But just like one caveat to that is, we talked earlier about burnout. Like, there are people who are going to end up in economically vulnerable situations in the next few months or the next year or two, partly related to COVID and partly just because that happens always in life. So I always tell, like, especially younger, very idealistic activists and donors, try to, include an element of self-care. And that means both not working yourself to the bone and, ending up in a situation where you have to completely pull out of the animal welfare movement, which many of us have seen. We have seen good people have to pull out because they push themselves too hard. And it also means, I think, if you can give the money, but be realistic. We should probably, many people should have a buffer of some kind. I always worry when I see young, very dedicated people who are, they're making a relatively small salary and they're being very economical, but not spending any money wastefully. And then at the end of the year, they're like, great, wow, so I was able to save this money, so now I can give it all away. But, the time may come where you need that money, and the movement needs you intact. So just try to take care of yourself as well, both in personal terms and in terms of saving a bit of money for a rainy day.
And I would kind of, to echo that, community is so important in EA. Like, it's so important. I know I would not be here if I did not have the EA community to lean on. So definitely, especially now that a lot of events are virtual, people being able to chime in to different events. I know New York City's EA chapter has virtual events all the time, and I would just urge folks to join a community. And obviously you're on this call, so you are, but pushing yourself that, there are resources out there for us as advocates, us as donors, and to use them, because burnout is real for sure. And I would also probably urge folks to look for mentors in the space. Mentors who, two people who are friends can be each other's mentors. So that is to just be able to lean on in this community is so important.
Really nice, kind of not closing, but closing this section of the event remarks from you all. So I'm going to hand it over to our co-host, Rocky, who's my colleague at Aquatic Life Institute and no pressure for anybody to feel like they have to talk about fish in particular in this event. So I'm really glad the questions are really, really general. So I'll hand it over to Rocky. I see we've got some really interesting questions in a wide variety of areas. So thank you all. I'll hand it over.
Great, thanks, Becky. And thank you all so much for being on the panel and for everyone for attending. I'm totally loving this and excited to hear your answers to some of the questions that have rolled in the chat. So I think to kind of start us off with that, Jasper asks, what are some of the best ways to engage and support the general public or potential donors in giving to animal advocacy causes? So this might be, someone, maybe a family member or colleague, and someone who maybe isn't oriented in the way that probably most of the attendees are toward looking at animal nonprofits.
Yeah, I would say one, just us as advocates, as donors, being good examples. I have had so many people over the years come to me and say, hey, you look like you're doing wonderful things. Like, what charities can I support that you support? And so being someone who represents the movement well, represents the movement positively, I think is just like a foundation of where to start.
Yeah, I'll say I'm completely unsuccessful at this, so do not listen to what I have to say. My parents are still like given to dog and cat charities, and they think that's what I'm asking them to do. When I was younger, my tactic was to be very aggressive, to show people the videos. I became a vegan after seeing the videos, so I was like, yeah, if I just show them enough graphic violence, like they're gonna want to give all their money to everything I care about. I was super wrong. That does not work. That just makes you have fewer friends. So I think that trying to appeal to people compassionately, hearing what people are telling you, backing off when they are asking you to back off, and just going in with a generous and compassionate and non-angry approach seems to have better success.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I've been singularly unsuccessful at personally convincing anyone of anything in my life.
Jacob, that is not true, but I love you underselling yourself in that way. That's hilarious.
Poor Jacob. But yeah, maybe if anyone in the audience too has any thoughts beyond it, definitely feel free to add it in the chat as well, because I know some people are just like particularly adept at this, and I definitely want to learn your tricks. But we'll move on to a question from Katie, who says, thoughts on whether it is more impactful for those of us who are not major donors to give to orgs like HSUS that can make large-scale legislative progress, or small startup orgs where your small donation, quote unquote, feels like it can have more of an impact for the org. And I'm going to just add on to this my own question, which is, and I know you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but thoughts on kind of giving large sums or the bulk of your donation to a singular nonprofit versus maybe kind of spreading it out.
Well, I will start, but yeah, I'm especially curious. I think Amanda really, this is sort of her job to understand questions like this. So I'm especially curious to hear what she has to say. All I will point out is that part of a donation is a relationship between you as a donor and the recipient. And that relationship can go different places. You can learn a lot about a group by how you interact with them. And there can be a sort of personal element there. Maybe the people from that group leave to other groups. So I think donating is not just a matter of like, I have money, all of a sudden you have money. It's also an interaction between a person and an organization. And that's part of why I think, for example, it can be good to donate to multiple groups rather than just one, partly because then you learn about the different groups and you can compare your interactions with them. And that's, even if the money involved isn't very significant, that can be productive.
Now I feel like I have to say something smart because Jacob said that I would, and I'm not going to, but I'll say something anyway. I think this is a difficult question. I think it depends on a lot of variables, one of which is the amount of time you have to invest in your decision making. Making smart funding decisions, I think, is really time consuming and requires so much information gathering. If you are like a person with a busy life and a full-time job and you're not going to be able to devote that much time to it, I would probably give more smaller grants because you're likely to hit upon something really good in there. If you are a person, Jacob seems unconvinced by that, but I'll let it stand. If you're a person who's going to spend a lot of time in it, I think sometimes organizations can do more with a larger grant. It depends. If you're able to find the size of an organization's budget, I would let that also be influential. I think if it's an organization with like many, many millions of dollars and you're giving a grant of $100 or $10, like that's going to effectively make no difference to them. If you have $100 and you're giving to an organization with a yearly budget of $5,000, that makes a big difference to them. So I would try to scale it based on how much you have to give and how large the organization's budget is. I do think in general, if you have a fairly small amount to give, giving to organizations with smaller organizational budgets is probably a better bet. I like regranting programs a lot if you don't have a lot of time, or even if you don't have a lot of funds, because those can add up. I saw someone had listed a number of organizations that do regranting. ACE has got a regranting program. The EA fund has got regrants. They've all done, I think, a pretty excellent job finding organizations. So that might also be a good bet for you, and a way to hit multiple organizations with only one decision point.
Yeah, no further thoughts on my end.
Great, cool. So wasn't quite a question, but kind of a comment that we had that I personally have a question from. So Theron says there's a good Dan Pallotta talk about this issue and how our thinking about charities can be problematic. For example, we feel like people doing good shouldn't be making money, and linked to a YouTube video that I assume is of that talk. And so the question I have from that, I guess, is there kind of a threshold in your own thoughts around giving for what, maybe income on the part of a paid employee of a nonprofit should look like? And something that I personally kind of go back and forth on is, volunteer only smaller groups versus organizations where there is paid staff. And I know we touched on this a little bit with the, thoughts about maybe like HR employees, that sort of thing. But kind of in looking at the full, I guess, a spectrum of nonprofits with that, how you factor in those sorts of questions.
I'm happy to start here. I think Jacob made a good point earlier that outputs are so much more important than inputs. And so if you've got a scrappy, all volunteer-led organization that's able to achieve a lot, that's awesome. I wouldn't necessarily discount an organization because they had highly paid staff. I think donors, I know that I was just recommending giving if you have a small amount to give to smaller organizations, but I think donors, especially large donors, tend to over prioritize really small organizations and starting new organizations and wanting to feel like a big piece of the pie and feeling like, oh, I'm like 50% or 70% of your budget. That's so awesome. I'm so important. But there are very real startup costs to starting new organizations. And I think sometimes if you have 5 one-staff organizations, they're not able to achieve as much as one like 10-staff organization. And the reality is when you have a large organization, you need to attract more highly skilled, more competitive people who are able to draw salaries. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to be a person who draws a higher salary if you're doing a really good job at your organization. We've talked a lot about THL on this call. They are awesome. They've achieved so much. If they wanted, if Dave Komen-Heidi wanted to draw a big salary to do what he's been doing, God bless him. Like, I'm happy for him to do that.
Just say, Dave, if you're watching, this is your chance to pitch Amanda.
Well, I was about to say, I'm pretty sure Dave takes like one of the lowest salaries at THL. So just for the record.
Yeah, any other thoughts on that one, Rachel and Jacob?
I don't, and sadly, I have a hard out in a couple minutes, so I'm gonna hop off shortly.
Yeah, no worries. And got a few more questions here, but I guess maybe a good one to wrap up on, so I know it's getting a little late for folks. Going to do kind of a combo question from Jyoti, who says, what are the key performance indicators you watch for in an effective charity? And Michael, who asks, what do you think are some of the most important research questions for us to work on? So if you have thoughts on either or both to kind of close us out tonight, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will go first and hop off after this and put my email in the chat. So if anyone does want to reach out, feel free to. But in terms of research questions, I would urge folks to look at the more legislative route for animals. You know, Amanda, I'm excited that you are excited about progress made in Europe on the legislative route. A part of me is like, oh, I wish she was excited about here too. But that just means that we need to do more work here. So I would say, you know, what are some important research questions? You know, what can be done for animals in the political realm? And that's something that I'm constantly thinking about every single day of my life, of my working life. So excited about that.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rachel.
I feel this is something where Amanda is the authority on the call from my perspective, but one very basic point I would make as somebody who is not like a professional evaluator of charities, and the KPI on the key performance indicators or whatever question, just like the number of animals involved is like a very, very crude measure. But the reality is most animal giving out there doesn't really factor it in at all, as far as I can tell. So maybe that's an overstatement, but I would try to defend it. The sheer number of animals is not everything. You could say, you know, I'm doing some work related to shrimp, and then there's, I don't know how many ungodly billions of shrimp are involved, but the fact that there's billions of shrimp doesn't mean what you're doing is important. Maybe you're having no effect. Maybe you're having a negative effect. Maybe you're, you know, maybe you're just a distraction. But certainly a starting point for looking at an animal group's work, I think a reasonable starting point is just to look at what is the scope of the animals concerned. You know, I guess I'm looking at this from a Humane League point of view. You know, the Humane League works largely on chickens, and there are, up till now anyway, and there are, I forget, what is it, tens of billions, maybe 70 billion chickens or something slaughtered every year, I forget. And I just find it's a bit unfortunate sometimes. I say that to somebody and it just slides right off them. I feel like people don't process numbers well, and they say, well, you know, that's nice, but I've got this other project I'm really excited about that could help dozens of animals. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I think a diversity of approaches is appropriate, but I do think it should at least be a factor. It should be, at least the numbers should be part of the conversation. And I feel sometimes less so obviously in the effective animal world, effective altruism world, where numbers are, if anything, often overrated. In wider circles, I think sometimes numbers are not given their due.
KPIs is so hard. For any one individual strategy, I feel like KPIs are pretty easy to set. The thing that's so challenging as a funder or just like a human in the world is using KPIs that you can use across charities. Everything that you can come up with, someone is going to have a very real, very legitimate critique of, because they feel too flattening, they feel too false, they feel too easy. But at the end of the day, you really do need to have some way of comparing this group that's working for policy changes in Europe on fish to this group that's like trying to do abolition in Malaysia. And it's like, how do you even have the language to compare those? So I just want to preface that I know that anything I say is crude. I'm sure that there are people on the call who have critiques, super valid. I hear you. I think about them a lot as well. Numbers of animals, I do think is an important calculation. Numbers of animals affected, the possibility of affecting more numbers of animals. I think the degree to which you can improve the lives of each animal you're touching matters a lot. So if you're doing an intervention that is helping an animal like a very small amount for 2 days, obviously that's not as helpful as something that is going to profoundly change this animal's life for a year or whatnot. And I also think the potential for longevity is important. So if you're spending a lot or focusing a lot on an intervention that can be very easily yanked away, I think that you need to discount that against an intervention that feels more lasting. So if we use corporate campaigns as an example of like, that is a very easy type of intervention, kind of, to put numbers around. You know, I would think about how many animals were helped by this corporate campaign, in what way were they helped, what is the likelihood that the corporate commitment is going to be enacted, what is the likelihood that it will stay enacted. Those are the different kinds of KPIs that I would look at. But it's tough. If anyone has better ideas, I would be very excited to hear them.
Great, thank you. And I know we could probably continue the conversation for 3 more hours, but I just wanted to thank our panelists so much for joining us tonight. Not to toot our own horn here, but I think we've done a very good job choosing our panelists for all of our recent events. And definitely just thank you so much for participating. For anyone who is not aware, this is a recurring scheme of events that we put together. So we've got the Effective Animal Advocacy panels and meetups, and then the aquatic specific ones as well. I had put a link in the comments to our newsletter sign up for that. So definitely feel free to sign up so you can stay in the loop, and also to reach out to me personally if you have any ideas for future events too, because I know there's a lot for us to cover, and probably a lot of people on the call as well could even present at a future event. I also just want to plug our events for December. So on December 12th, we're going to be hearing from Panelists, which is an animal charity evaluators standout charity for 2020. And they're going to be presenting on their 2020 research. So you'll definitely want to be there for that. And then for our aquatic specific event, it'll be December 19th. And both of these will be at noon Eastern time. And we'll be hearing about the issue of aquatic animals who are killed specifically to be used as feed. And if you were at our event on Saturday, you got a little taste of that. It's about 1.2 trillion animals killed each year just to be fed to other animals. So we'll be doing a deep dive into that issue as well, which is something that I know I personally, until relatively recently, did not have any sense of the full scope of. So it should be really, really informative. And you can catch past events, including this one, on the Aquatic Life Institute Facebook page, where we've got the recordings of the past live streams. But thank you all so much again for joining us. And yeah, stay tuned for more and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rocky and Becky and Eli. It's a real service to the community to host these. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, we couldn't do it without our amazing panelists. So thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, everyone. This was wonderful.
Bye.